All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rita. I'm from the Wood County Committee on Aging, and I'm very fortunate to have Mike McMaster here from our Wood County Museum. He has been doing programs for us every single month now. And so, Mike, without further ado, go ahead and take it away.
All right, I will share my screen, and here we go. Okay. Hopefully this opens up okay.
Yep, it's coming up pretty good here.
All right. And if you can see the Wood County Museum, we are just about at the time where that magnolia tree will bloom. The flower garden you see has been greatly expanded and stays kind of lush and green all year long. This program is about military history, but you do not need to be a military expert to follow it. This is slightly longer than our usual program, so we'll get started. This program is about the Irish invasion of Canada. Perhaps you did not know the Irish invaded Canada, but I will tell you when they did this. Now, there were two other American invasions of Canada. The first occurred in 1775 when the colonial American army led by General Montgomery attacked Quebec in Canada. Similar to the Irish later, they thought if they would march to Canada, the Canadians would join them and throw off the yoke of British rule. But this did not happen. The next invasion of Canada was very successful. The man on the right was William Henry Harrison, and in October of 1813, after recapturing Detroit, invaded Western Ontario. The death of Tecumseh, the Native American leader, occurred at the Battle of the Thames River that year. Now, this is the 155th anniversary of the Fenian Irish invasion of Canada. And if you were a patriotic Irish American, you might own the print shown in the center, the green above the red, depicting the battle that was fought in Canada in 1866. Now, the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed, of course, on March 17th, 1858 in Ireland, dedicated for independent, democratic, Republican Ireland. The Irish Brotherhood was active between 1858 and 1924. Now, of course, in America, there were tens of thousands of Irishmen, and they also formed a branch of this Irish Republican Brotherhood. On the left is Michael Doheny. He was one of the founders. On the right is John O'Mahony. He was a Celtic scholar and named the American Brotherhood the Fenian Brotherhood, named after the legendary Irish warrior Finn McCool. Now, James Stephens was the Irish Republican Brotherhood leader in Ireland. And in 1865, he called for an Irish invasion, although none took place in Ireland. In 1848, in America, an invasion of Canada was called for by the Irish in America, and they said the lion of England's whelp should be lashed, Canada be invaded. She herself loudly demands it. Just like our colonial predecessors, the Irish believed if they invaded Canada, the Canadians would rise up against the English. Now, both the Fenian president and the Senate of the Fenians in America began issuing bonds in the name of the Irish Republic. Above is a $10 note. And if you bought this, you would, of course, be paid back during an independent Irish Republic. Just to tell you how many armed Irish there were in America. In 1867, at the Great Philadelphia Convention of the Fenians in America, over 6,000 uniformed Irish Fenians marched through the streets in one great parade. Now, the Irish experience in the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 had trained tens of thousands of Irish in both the North and the Irish in the South in the military trade. On the left is General Fighting Tom Sweeney. He was a general during the Civil War, and after the Civil War, he turns in his commission in the United States Army and takes a commission in the Fenian Irish Army as their Secretary of War. Throughout the American Civil War, the North, the Union was against Great Britain, and they saw British duplicity in the American Civil War. The man on the right is the Union with his club, the man on the left, the secessionists, the Confederates, and who is giving the Confederates arms to fight against the Union? You can see circled with the area or the arrow is England. That is John Bull representing England, is giving the Confederates arms. And another thing that the Union was very angry about with England, England was building ships for the Confederates during the Civil War. The most famous was the Confederate ship, the Alabama, which wreaked havoc on Union shipping. Now, by April 1866, after the Civil War, there were thousands of Irish volunteers and Civil War veterans, former Union and Confederate Irish soldiers united in a common Irish cause. The Fenian hierarchy established a command structure, and they had weapons and ammunition, and it was time to strike Canada. Of course, above is an Irish Fenian flag. But like the history of Ireland so many times, the Fenian Brotherhood had $500,000 in its coffers, but split into dividing factions. The man on the left is William Roberts. He was the leader of the Fenian Senate and favored invasion of Canada. On the right, John O'Mahony was the president of the Fenians, and he wanted an Ireland first policy. Now, John O'Mahony knew that he had to do something in order to retain control of the Irish Brotherhood, the Fenians in America. He called for an invasion of Canada in the state of Maine at Campobello Island. That is where FDR vacationed. Over 1,000 armed Fenian soldiers massed on the Maine and Canadian border. Why did they want to take over Campobello Island in 1866? John O'Mahony said, we must have some place to place a flag. They were going to declare Campobello Island an independent Irish nation and issue letters of marque, pirate, warrants for an Irish pirate navy. President Andrew Johnson, he knew that 1,000 armed Irish were in Maine, and when asked for his reaction, Johnson replied that he would recognize accomplished facts. He was going to do nothing and just wait to see what was happening. But like the history of Ireland, as early as a year before the Campobello Island, spies had sold the plans to invade New Brunswick to the British Consul of Canada, Archibald, the man seated at the right. The New York Times labeled this the Fenian Fizzle. The schooner Ocean Spray, pictured at the top left, was supposed to deliver the majority of arms to these Irish soldiers. It was intercepted by the American naval ship, pictured in the center, the Wisniewski, and General Meade, pictured on the right, the hero of the Civil War, intervened to prevent the Irish from crossing the Canadian border. Also, with the plans sold to the Canadians, 6 British warships arrived with over 700 British soldiers to protect Campobello Island. There was nothing the Fenians could do without arms or transportation. And the Fenians expended $40,000 on this fiasco and denounced the president of the Fenians, John O'Mahony, and he had lost control. Now, the Fenians, at this exact same time, were planning a 3-pronged attack into Canada. General Sweeney on the left, the Fenian Secretary of War, had a 3-pronged attack. Number 1 arrow, Fenians from Chicago would sail to Ontario West. Fenians from Detroit would attack Windsor, and Fenians in the east would cross at Buffalo and surround the Canadians in that western province. And the Fenians had arms they had concentrated in Toledo, Sandusky, and Cleveland. Now, the man who was in charge of spying on the Fenians in Canada was the man in the center, Gilbert McMicken. And he stated, "I cannot conceive it within the bounds of reasonable probability that Sweeney will attempt any demonstration upon Canada now. I can gather nothing from any quarter at present of anything being done indicative of movement of any kind, unless we take the absence of bluster and the unusual quiet everywhere as an indication." And he said, "In the matter of Buffalo, New York, I have things constantly and tolerably well under supervision." At the time he was writing this, hundreds of armed Irishmen across the United States had boarded trains to invade at Buffalo. He wrote to the man on the right, John Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, and he writes back, "I think the row between Stephens and Sweeney, the 2 factions, puts an end to the whole affair. Many thanks for your amusing letter as the proceedings of the bold Fenians." So they are making fun of the Irish at the very moment the Irish were bound to invade at Buffalo, New York. Now, the 2 pillars of Canadian military strength were the Imperial garrison stationed across Canada, and they relied heavily on the untrained Canadian militia. Above is what they call the awkward squad of businessmen and farmers trained to be soldiers. Now, the Canadian militia had in their hands Spencer 7-shot repeating rifles. And one of the Canadian members of the militia said, "We knew our Enfield rifles, but nothing of these new rifles. In the hands of inexperienced Canadian militia soldiers, the Spencer repeating rifle proved to be a dubious asset. Without training, these were difficult rifles to shoot." Now, the leader of the Irish Fenians bound for Buffalo wrote, "I have left Nashville, Tennessee on May 27th with 115 men. We arrived in Cleveland, Ohio, the night of the 28th, but received no orders, and we arrived in Buffalo the morning of the 30th. The entire time, hundreds of men from Nashville to Buffalo were loading trains with weapons, telling everybody they were bound to invade Canada, but the Canadian spies failed to see this. The leader of the Irish Fenians happened to be Colonel John O'Neill. He writes, "The night of the 31st of May, being the appointed time of crossing, I received no written instructions and had no map of Canada, but they proceeded to invade anyway without orders or maps." Now, when the Irish crossed Canada from Buffalo to Fort Erie, Canada, Colonel O'Neill said they did not have but 600 men. By this time, Colonel O'Neill had cut the telegraph lines to larger Canadian cities, but 2 Canadian forces were approaching them. The big arrow at the top was the regular British Army, led by Colonel Peacock, regular trained British soldiers. The arrow at the bottom, 840 Canadian militia who had never fought a battle in their life. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel Dennis, who was an auctioneer, not a soldier. The men who had crossed from Buffalo were battle-hardened Civil War veterans. Colonel O'Neill wrote that he knew that 2 forces were approaching from 2 different directions, and his plan was to get between the 2 and defeat one of them before they could come together and completely outnumber him. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Dennis, the man with the big whiskers on the right, was instructed by Colonel Peacock, wait until further orders. Do not attack the Fenians. Lieutenant Colonel Dennis completely disregarded this and left another inexperienced man, Lieutenant Colonel Booker, in charge of the whole force. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Dennis leaves his army, boards a tugboat bound across Lake Erie for Fort Erie. Lieutenant Colonel Dennis's orders were given to him by Captain Akers to consult and advise him not to leave his men nor attack the Fenians, but he went ahead with this anyway. Colonel Peacock wrote hastily, "I do not approve of this change of plans. Please acknowledge receipt of this telegram." But by then it was too late. Lieutenant Colonel Dennis and a handful of men had already boarded the tugboat and sailed around Lake Erie. Lieutenant Colonel Booker was left in command, and about 8 in the morning, Booker's men, despite orders, start shooting at Fenian skirmishers. The Battle of Ridgeway, Canada began at 8 in the morning on June 2nd, 1866. One of the Irish Fenian songs is, "We'll go and capture Canada, for we've nothing else to do." Many of these Confederate and Union Irishmen were unemployed they had nothing better to do but to invade Canada. Now, Booker's red arrow was Booker's advance. They had met a few Irish skirmishers that wildly fired at each other from great distance, not doing much harm. The Irish skirmishers start retreating, but little did Booker know that Colonel O'Neill's main force had built a barricade and were hidden in a woods. That was the majority of the Irish force was hidden. Here is a drawing of the Battle of Ridgeway. You can see the red and green coated Canadians fighting with a few scattered skirmishers. At this time, someone saw Colonel O'Neill riding on his horse to rally the skirmishers. And then the bugle call was called to the Canadian soldiers that cavalry was coming, even though it was just a man on a horse. And they stopped their advance. Now, you do not need to be a military expert to see how the Canadians, shown in red, lost this battle. Colonel Booker gives so many orders to his inexperienced Canadians that chaos ensued. The square in the center were the Canadians trying to repel the cavalry, which never came. The arrow from left to right, he wanted the left to move to the right, the center to move to the left, and on the far right, the orders to retreat were given, and then to not retreat were given. Colonel O'Neill and the Irishmen come out of the forest and see this great confusion. Fire volleys killed many of the Canadians and charged them. Had one Canadian officer wrote, had the retire not been sounded, we would have beaten the Irish in 10 minutes more. Too much confusion, little trained Canadian troops. O'Neill holds the battlefield and is victorious, and the Canadian militia retreats helter-skelter back to Port Colborne, where they had departed railroad trains earlier that day. Now, more Irishmen attempted to cross from Buffalo, but the gunboat USS Michigan, an American gunboat, intercepts reinforcements, and no other Irish soldiers can cross into Canada. Colonel Booker has to send a telegraph to Colonel Peacock, and he states, I have returned to Port Colborne with this command thoroughly worn out. A panic seemed to momentarily take place, and a good many men having been lost, all hope of support. The battle was lost in an hour and a half at 9:30 a.m. Colonel Peacock of the regular British forces must have been furious, because the only order he gave was not to attack the Irish. Now, this was not the only battle. The Irish, after winning at Ridgeway, go back to Fort Erie, the very small town in Canada. And who should they meet but Lieutenant Colonel Dennis, the man with the whiskers at the bottom right. He has about 50 men against 600 Irishmen who had just won a battle. And the fight, which wasn't much of a fight, was the whole expedition was lost. Colonel Peacock hastily cuts his whiskers, puts on a farmer's coat, and runs away from his men who were captured. Now, by this time, President Andrew Johnson orders General Meade at the bottom right to prevent the Canadians from crossing into Canada. Colonel O'Neill and the Fenian officers are captured, returning to Buffalo, but are released on bail. The Canadian soldiers are paroled and sent back to New York and Nashville and Toledo because Andrew Johnson needed the Irish voters. Now, if you were a patriotic Irishman, you might own this print showing the Battle of Ridgeway, the Irish army defeating the red-coated British. 7 Canadians were killed on the battlefield. 2 died shortly afterwards from wounds. 4 later on would die, and 94 Canadians were wounded or disabled in this fight. Here is my favorite depiction. This is the Battle of Ridgeway and the victory of O'Neill, the masterly retreat of the Queen's Own. You can see O'Neill with his sword and hat in hand, and the British soldiers retreating and dropping their weapons. I like this picture. Here is a picture of the funeral in Toronto of the volunteers killed at the Battle of Ridgeway. And if you go to that cemetery, there is a monument. What did this invasion do to Canada? It caused the Canadians to take seriously military preparedness. It also caused a Confederation of Canada the following year for their mutual protection. Colonel O'Neill tried his hand in invading Canada a few more times on much smaller scale. He was captured in 1870, but President Ulysses S. Grant paroled him because he needed the Irish votes as well. If you go to St. James Cemetery in Toronto, you will find the monument for the Canadians killed at the Battle of Ridgeway. And at least once, I don't know if they do it every year, but at historic old Fort Erie in Ontario, they had a battle reenactment on the 150th anniversary of the Fenian raids. Now, this, they said, was the first Irish victory over the British since the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745 during the War of the Irish or the Austrian Succession. This was the first Irish victory. The Irish were very proud of this small battle fought in Canada. General O'Neill, and he is now a general, writes his official narrative of the Battle of Ridgeway at that time and sells it for 30 cents a piece, and he makes his money. He moves to Nebraska and helps settle the Irish in Nebraska. That is the end of this talk, and this is March. And when you celebrate St. Patrick's Day, remember the Irish in America had at once invaded Canada. And I will stop my share. I hope you could hear that. I had to move the pace up a little to cover a lot of history, but hopefully you understood it and you did not need to be a military expert to see what happened.
Thank you, Mike. So I will allow everybody, you can unmute yourself if you have a comment or question for Mike.
Yes, I was going to tell him I really liked the photograph. Those were really cool.
I tried to use the best images of the day. And like I said, you did not need to be a military expert to see how the confusion led to the Canadians' defeat.
Anybody else?
Oh,
well, Mike, thank you so much.
Yeah, and like I said,
as always, joining us every month.
Yeah, and when you celebrate St. Patrick's Day this year, you can remember and maybe give a toast to the victorious Irish who invaded Canada 155 years ago.
Yes. Oh, Carlton, did you have a question?
Actually, it's another a question related to the Irish. Did you ever do any research or give a talk about the use of Irish labor and the construction of the Erie Canal system and also
No,
Grand Lake?
yeah, not yet. The canal pretty much bypassed Wood County on the far side of the Maumee River. A very short canal was built between, I think, Waterville and Perrysburg at one time, but when it was complete, so was the railroad and it went out pretty quickly. But that is a good idea for future talk.
Because I know that they used a lot of Irish and German labor in that, the construction of the Grand Lake. And the Grand Lake is on high ground.
Yeah.
And that fed the canal system gravity-wise, north and south. And the story I heard was that they didn't get paid much, and it was all hand labor, really
Yeah.
hard labor.
Oh, yes, very much
And,
so.
but they got a jigger of whiskey at the end of the day.
Yes. All right, Rita, I'm going to leave the chat and thank you for inviting
Thank you,
me.
everybody. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful
Mike.
day.
Thank you.